this is to do with housing and how housing has affected us, and of course it affects us now. We're living in the suburbs, a lot of us, and why are we living in these suburbs, which are so inconvenient, so messy? Well, Dr. Jones will tell us and will give us the right answer. Dr. Jones, let's give him a big hand of applause. Thank you for coming, Dr. Jones.
Thank you for having me. I guess it's appropriate that I'm speaking to Catholic engineers because I'm going to be talking about social engineering and the impact that it had on, first of all, housing in general, but also the Catholic ethnic neighborhoods that many of us grew up in the period following World War II. In the 1930 edition of his famous book, Behaviorism, which first appeared in 1913, when Europe was about to dissolve into war, John B. Watson tried to relay any fears his readers might have concerning social engineering. First of all, he assured them, we all must admit that social experimentation is going on at a very rapid rate at present, at an alarmingly rapid rate for comfortable conventional souls. As an example of social experimentation, we have war. Since the Big Three Foundations, which funded Watson, also funded Gunnar Myrdal's book, it should come as no surprise that The American Dilemma, a huge book of over 1,000 pages in length, should advance the cause of social engineering under the cover of war. Its message is simple. Human nature is changeable and will be changed by social engineering. The immediate impetus for social engineering was brought on by the war with fascism and enabled by the defeat of the isolationists, whose policies were based on outmoded ideas of race. But its effects will continue after the war. In fact, the main thrust of social engineering will take place after the war. The race issue in this regard was the thin end of a very large wedge that would soon have enormous repercussions on where people would live, where their children would go to school, and other aspects of life. America, according to Myrdal, needed to solve its race problem before it could assume its role as a leader of the coalition against fascism and then the leader of the new internationalist world order following fascism's defeat. Myrdal's vision of the future is both frank and chilling. And this is a direct quote from The American Dilemma. From the point of view of social science, this means, among other things, that social engineering will be increasingly demanded. Many things that for a long period have predominantly been a matter of individual adjustment will become more and more determined by political decision and public regulation. We are entering an era where fact-finding and scientific theories of causal relations will be seen as instrumental in planning controlled social change. The peace will bring nothing but problems, one mounting upon another, and consequently new urgent tasks for social engineering. The American social scientist, because of the New Deal and the war, is already acquiring familiarity with planning and practical action. He will never again be given the opportunity to build up so disinterested social science. Social engineering of the coming epoch, Myrdal continues, will be nothing but the drawing of practical conclusions from the teaching of social science that human nature is changeable and that human deficiencies and unhappiness are, in a large degree, preventable. We have today in social science a greater trust in the improvability of man and society than we have ever had since the Enlightenment. Now, Gunnar Myrdal began work on The American Dilemma in 1939. The Carnegie Corporation had chosen him to head the project because he was a Swede, which meant someone outside of the polarized racial situation in America at that time. In addition to being an outsider, Myrdal was someone who had done work with his feminist wife Alva on family and population, which the Carnegie Foundation found congenial. He was also chosen because he was a socialist, and as such, he was part of the Common Front alliance with the communists against fascism at the time. Alger Hiss, who subsequently was shown to be a communist spy, was prominent in the Carnegie Corporation at the time. The Carnegie people contacted Gunnar Myrdal in August of 1937. After turning them down once, Myrdal finally decided to become involved in a study on which he had no experience. The first memorandum on the planning of the research to be undertaken was then submitted to the Carnegie Foundation on January 28, 1939. The Nazis invaded Poland 8 months later. In April of 1940, they invaded Denmark and Norway, and at this point, Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish patriot, left the United States. He left the project. You can read in the introduction to the book that he left it in what he calls the capable hands of Samuel A. Stouffer, whom he identifies as a sociologist at the University of Chicago. What Myrdal does not tell us is that in handing the project over to Stouffer, he was placing it in the hands of the American psychological warfare establishment. And that meant in the hands of the man who probably wrote most of the book, namely Louis Wirth, the sociologist from the University of Chicago. If you go to the University of Chicago archives, you will find there that Louis Wirth admits to writing 8 chapters of The American Dilemma. I think he wrote more than that, but I think there were other people who wrote it as well. There are long chapters on the need for contraception among Negroes in the South. Frank Notstein is mentioned as part of the credits of the book. I think Frank Notstein wrote this part because he was an expert on population control. He was a demographer at Princeton University, the teacher of John D. Rockefeller III, who was the founder a few years later of the Population Council. In other words, it seems pretty clear, given the evidence, that it was physically impossible for Gunnar Myrdal to write an over 1,000-page book on a topic which he admittedly knew nothing about within a period of what would have to be 8 months, since he left the country in 1940. The book came out in 1943. So at this point, it seems to me appropriate to shift our attention to Louis Wirth, the sociologist whom I think was basically the prime author of The American Dilemma. On April 10th, 1941, which is to say 8 months before America would enter the war, Louis Wirth presented a scholarly paper on the present position of minorities in the United States at a sociology symposium. The newer European immigrants, Wirth wrote, coming at the time of the greatest industrial expansion, are overwhelmingly concentrated in the larger industrial cities and retain to a much greater degree the compactness of their ethnic communities. In some cases, their colonies in the cities of the United States exceed their numbers in the largest cities of their respective mother countries. Louis Wirth was a sociologist from the University of Chicago, which is another way of saying that he was in the psychological warfare establishment, which at this moment's history, in the nation's history, meant keeping tabs on America's ethnics, which meant, in common parlance, the recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, but the Irish as well. As the inclusion of the Irish indicated, the common denominator among these groups was not geographical, it was religious. Since virtually every group in the United States was an ethnic group, including groups which were involved in spying on the other groups, Wirth had to explain why some groups posed more of a threat to American security than others. To do this, he had to get into religion. A quote again from the same talk. In the face of the numerical as well as economic, social, and political dominance of the Protestant groups, the Catholic population may be regarded, and in certain communities thinks of itself as a distinct minority, especially since in some communities Catholicism is also associated with Irish, Italian, Polish, or certain other ethnic or national origin groups. Whereas the internal division and lack of cohesion of the Protestant denominations detracts from their capacity to play the role of a dominant group effectively, the relative internal unity and concentration of settlement of the Catholic groups in the urban centers increases their capacity to act collectively and develop an appropriate group consciousness. Although there is no indication that he read it, Worth's analysis of the ethnic situation is virtually identical with Blanchard's analysis of Bridesburg, the Polish neighborhood in Philadelphia, which was written during World War I, when the intelligence community of that era had similar concerns. The Committee for Public Information, the CPI, run by Frank Creel. The unspoken assumption behind Worth's analysis, a view which would find expression in Paul Blanchard's book, when it came out in the late 1840s, is that Catholics had a congenital weakness for fascism. In fact, both Blanchard and Bertrand Russell, whom he praises in American Freedom and Catholic Power, would claim that Catholicism and fascism were politically indistinguishable. This was of special concern to the intelligence community because, in Worth's words, the totalitarian nations of Europe have substantial representation of their subjects or former subjects in the United States, a fact worth emphasizing in the light of their extended concept of nationality. Once again, war was creating ethnophobia in the intelligence community, which worried about the descendants of these foreign-born residents who presumably are at least in part subject to the ideologies of their respective mother communities. Close quote. Once again, the intelligence community was trying to disrupt communications among subject peoples whose populations had increased significantly in the intervening 20 years. One instance of this, which I mention in the book, is the Pole Town in Detroit. One of the Palmer raids, during the 1920s, right after World War I, went to the Polish Union organization in Poletown, and they found all sorts of literature, but no one could read Polish. And so there was no ability to know what these people were saying to each other. And that alone posed a threat to the people who wanted to know what was going on. The numbers, according to Worth, and the numbers that we're dealing with here of ethnic, foreign ethnics, were impressive. This again is a quote from Worth. Of our total foreign white stock of 38,720,593, more than 1/6 is German and nearly 1/8 is Italian. If we note further that the Italians have the highest percentage of any of the major immigrants unable to speak English, 15%, we have further reason to fear their exclusive susceptibility to news and propaganda purveyed by their foreign language press, which in part has been subsidized by agencies of the mother country's government. But the ethnic facts become even more worrisome when one considers the fact that most of these ethnics belong to one religious denomination. The change in ethnic makeup of the country has brought with it, according to Worth, quote, a corresponding shift in the religious affiliation of the American population, making, quote, the nation now a little over 1/3 Roman Catholic. As if that weren't bad enough, many of these people dominate, quote, certain highly skilled occupations in essential defense industries, close quote. In fact, quote again, some of the key skilled jobs are virtually monopolized by certain groups whose national origin makes them suspect. Whose